Thank you very much, Robinson Badia. And now we're going to have Naomi Polonsky in conversation with Nengi Omuku. Thank you, Nengi.
Thank you, Dr. Lorna.
Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Hi.
Hello everyone, I'm Naomi Polonsky, the Assistant Curator of the New Hall Art Collection, which is a collection of art by women housed at Murray Edwards College. And I'm so pleased to be here today in conversation with Nengi Omuku. Nengi is an artist based in Lagos, Nigeria. Her paintings explore the effect of contemporary social and political events on individuals and groups of people. And there's a dreamlike quality to her paintings, and they play with the line between representation and abstraction. They often respond to, or in some cases anticipate, current events, both local and global. And these include instances of police brutality in Nigeria, political protests, and recently the coronavirus pandemic. Nengi, some of your compositions are inspired by archival footage. Others are drawn purely from your imagination. These are two of your works from 2020. How do I go to the next slide? Liam, can I have the next slide?
You have to just keep pressing it. Arrow buttons don't always work. I think it's easy if you use the actual.
So just
So yeah, these are two of your works from 2020, Small Chaos and The Sit Down. I wonder whether you could say a bit about your process of creating these pieces and where the inspiration for them came from.
First of all, thank you so much, Naomi and Dr. Lorna, for inviting me to be part of this conference and also to be part of the show. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So yes, my paintings are inspired both by archival photography and current news media, like press photos that I find online, and also sometimes from imagination. So Small Chaos came from this moment where I guess during the beginning of the pandemic, I just started noticing major holes in our government and in the way that people were treated and situations were being handled. And one of the major things that happened just before the pandemic was a building with school children in it collapsed, and emergency services took a very long time to react. So what you had is this extraordinary moment where people sort of gathered and started filling the gaps that the government that were in place in our society. And there was this moment of incredible solidarity in rescuing children and removing people from the rubble. So Small Chaos is inspired in that way from photography. And I started noticing multiple things like sort of like collapsing in terms of like in our society and the way we were handling the pandemic and all the small tragedies that were happening. So I decided to create like this piece, which is called The Sit Down, as a kind of personal protest against all of these things that were happening. So The Sit Down came purely from my imagination, and it was, it's this moment where you just have this people just calmly sitting down and sort of speaking to these shadowy figures in the background. So this painting was created shortly before the EndSARS protest. So it was a personal piece for me in terms of protest. But in this sort of extraordinary moment, this actual piece was kind of enacted in our society where Nigerians from every tribe, every religion sort of like gathered and protested police brutality in Nigeria. And we had this moment where people were sitting down and peacefully protesting. And the Nigerian government gave an order to open fire on unarmed civilians. So it was a very unfortunate turn of events that happened in our country. Yeah.
Thank you. So another work of yours that responds to a particular social event is Technicolor Protest, which references the government ban on vehicles that many Nigerians use instead of cars and the protests that followed. What strikes me about this piece is the extraordinary colour in it, which is also referenced in the title. Can you say more about your relationship with colour and what it can communicate about the events and situations which you portray?
So this is another painting that was leading up to the sit down piece we saw before. And in this piece, I guess I was again, because I was locked in my house. So what I did have was the internet and media and things like this. So I was, scanning through and selecting and collaging. And I came across this moment, which, is sort of like suggested in the image that there is something outside of the picture that the viewers are, the people in the foreground and background are looking at. So if you follow their gaze, you'll see that what they're focusing on is outside of the image. And so is this image I found of a public lynching. So we had this point where people were sort of like riled up. There was a moment of desperation and a moment of severe lack during the pandemic. And people weren't working. There wasn't access to the relief that was being supplied because some politicians were hoarding these things. So I wanted to sort of create this image where the colors are present, but the colors are muted. So they're reflecting the somber moments that we were experiencing collectively, but some harsher than others. And so I wanted to use color in this kind of way to highlight this situation that was happening as a sort of way of a sort of like social commentary on what was going on. But again, you see the bodies and the faces and the anguish being depicted in how the skin or the bodies in the painting are being treated. In the foreground, for example, the figure in the forefront, you see this dripping out of his body and out of the canvas as a way to comment on the anguish and the personal grief that the figures were experiencing.
Yes, and something that you've spoken about in the past is how you aim to paint the mind. The backgrounds and landscapes in your compositions depict a kind of mental space, communicating the thoughts and emotions of the figures inhabiting them. And your figures are often faceless and kind of anonymous. For example, in this work, Gathering, there are several rows of figures who become increasingly faint and ghost-like as they merge into the background. So your works capture a kind of collective consciousness, but at the same time, they're often rooted in very personal experiences of yours or of people you know. What do you think the relationship is between the individual and the collective in your works?
I think at the beginning, when I started painting on this, Sonia, I was focusing a lot on individual stories. So sitters will come to my studio, they will tell me about their lives and I'll ask them to sit. And for me, the focus wasn't really on depicting representing the sitters. It was more on speaking about their state of mind. But for the past 2 years, my focus has shifted from the individual to the collective because of this sort of collective suffering that we've experienced globally. And also I'm thinking about how it's translating locally, how it's panning out in Nigeria and the ways in which we're coping. So I think with this piece, again, it was one of another, building collapsed, and you had this extraordinary moment again where people are ushering this body out of the rubble. And for me, the takeaway from the image I saw and from painting this piece was not really so much focusing on the grief of the collective, but focusing on how collective pain can be translated into this moment of solidarity, where we're focusing less on the individual and individual tragedies, and we're thinking a lot more about our humanity and about collective suffering, collective grief, and translating that into solidarity that is beyond race, color, religion, upbringing, experience. And you just have this moment of just being human and collectively experiencing things as just as human beings.
That's lovely. And Nengi's recent work, Collision, which was created just a month or so ago, is included in our current exhibition at the New Hall Art Collection, What Lies Beneath Women, Politics, Textiles. The exhibition brings together works by women artists and collectives using the medium of textiles to comment on gender and society. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about the medium you use. You started out painting oil on canvas, and in 2019 started using sonyon fabric, a traditional Nigerian fabric that was often used in clothing worn by members of wealthy Nigerian families in the pre-colonial era. So it has various connotations and speaks about the country's pre-colonial past. Can you say a bit more about your decision to use this medium and what the effect is on your paintings?
So I studied oil painting in England for 6 years as a slave, but before then I was born and brought up in Nigeria. And in that moment where I was in England, I felt a kind of disconnect with my society and with home. So for me, the whole process of returning home, I started seeing things with fresh eyes. And I realized at that moment that I wanted my re-entry and my re-engagement with my culture and my society to be through fabric and through textile. And so I started walking up to the older people in our society, like my grandma and other people, and asking them, what is your understanding of traditional Nigerian fabric? What is your understanding of traditional river fabric or traditional fabric from the southwest of Nigeria? And people were bringing out all of these extraordinary fabrics from their trunk boxes, and I was painting them as, in the sense of like depicting them in the painted form.
Apologies
as a
to
subject.
interrupt. If you could
Yeah.
round off in the next 30
Yeah.
seconds, because we've had 10 minutes now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. So I was depicting them in the paintings, but then eventually somebody introduced me to the Sonyo fabric. And at that moment, I realized that this should be both the object and subject of the painting, that I'll be having these conversations about contemporary society, but at the same time, having these dialogues with unnamed weavers that created this extraordinary fabric many, many years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nengi. I think we're opening up for a Q&A now, but thank you again for telling us a bit more about your amazing works.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nengi and Naomi, for that wonderful Q&A.